The idea of the spiritual death is literally coming to terms with the fact that we are mortal, that we are ephemeral creatures, that we will die, and to recognize that our suffering is bound to this artificial sense of who we are, our attachment to the ego itself. If you look in the Buddhist tradition, the Buddha said his first truth was that the world was suffering. His second truth was that the cause of suffering was desire. And what he meant there was that literally the cause of the suffering that exists in the world is our attachment to the world, our attachment to the idea of the self, to the idea of fame, to the idea of power, to the idea of all of these things. In the Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said that human beings are asleep, and when they die, they wake up. And he said, die before you die. And you will find this tradition in many different spiritual traditions. The idea of dying before you die is dying the death of meaning before the death of sensory comes to you. One of the Persian poets, Shahistari, said in an extraordinary poem, which is called Gulshan al-Firaz. If you wish to understand this meaning, and what he's talking about is really life itself, reflect on how existence is both death and life. Everything in the cosmos, terrestrial and celestial, has an example which is visible in your body and spirit. The cosmos, like you, is a specific person. You are as a spirit to it, and it is your body. Man dies in 3 different ways. The first death occurs in every breath because of his nature. And really, this is the idea of death and regeneration that's taking place in our bodies. And as people that have studied anatomy and physiology, I mean, we recognize this, that death is literally taking place. Cells are dying constantly in the body and being reborn. And part of taking in breath is literally for the regeneration of the cells themselves. So there is death and rebirth in every instant. So this is the first death. The second death is the death of choice, which is the spiritual death. The third is the death which is inevitable for him. Since death and life are opposites, his life is of 3 kinds and in 3 degrees. The cosmos has no death by choice, as you alone of all creation possess this. What the German philosopher Heidegger said was that everything perishes, but only the human being alone has demise. In other words, that we are literally the only creature that has a death that is conscious, that we are literally consciously aware of the act of dying. And the spiritual death is literally using exercises, death exercises, to arrive at a state of the death of the self. If you look at, for instance, in the Islamic tradition, the Hajj, the pilgrimage that Muslims make, and are encouraged to make as soon as possible, the Hajj is literally a dress rehearsal for death. The person takes care of all of their debts, all of their worldly responsibilities, writes their will if they haven't done it prior to that, says goodbye to their friends as if they don't expect to come back, goes to Mecca, circumambulates the house there, which is an empty square, in literally the garment that they will be buried in a death garment, a white cloth that has no threads in it and has no distinction of personality or fame. Everybody is equalized during this pilgrimage. And then they move between 2 places, literally running back and forth, which is symbolic of our state in the world, of moving back in a state of confusion. And the finality of the Hajj is to stand on what's known as the plane of gnosis, or knowledge. To stand as if you are standing on the day of resurrection. This is a spiritual exercise to come to terms with our death. When the person comes back, they should have come back as if they have died. In other words, they are literally ready to go back to their Lord. And so this idea of death acceptance, which really is in every tradition, we find this in all of the traditions. But in the Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, make mention of death at least 20 times in a day. His idea there is not to become morbidly fixated on death. The idea is not to wear black and to literally become somebody that is obsessed with the ultimate reality of death. No, it is to be literally a liberation from the chains of psychological death, from the chains of the routinization of the world, so that life literally becomes the experience of the moment. If you literally leave your house, not expecting to return in the evening, how will you leave your spouse? How will you leave your children? If with each meeting when you depart, with a recognition of death, how will that departure be? The intensity of life will be so enhanced that literally you will begin to become alive. And that is why the spiritual death is literally the rebirth of the soul. In the same way that the physical death is the rebirth of the soul, the spiritual death in this world, the death acceptance that takes place, becomes an opportunity whereby life becomes meaningful in each moment. And this is a challenge. It's not something that is easily acquired, and I don't think it's something that can be artificially created. It's literally a very real cognitive experience of the temporality of death. In the Buddhist tradition, the Buddha said that the most important meditation is the meditation of death. And in that tradition, the only permission that was given traditionally by Japanese Zen masters to meditate without permission was the meditation of death and of compassion. And ultimately, when you begin to accept death, compassion becomes increased. Compassion towards our fellow human beings becomes increased. Can we go to the next? This is from a physicist who talked about the order in existence. And he looked at it from a physical perspective of the idea of this pulsation that begins, and it's very interesting that as it moves out, the waves get bigger and ultimately end up in what we call explicate order, which is the world of the seeing of human beings, of all of this matter that we see formulated. And yet physicists tell us that it's really, this is not its real essence, that it's really actually energy moving at incredibly high speeds, but somehow brought together because of the density of the field. As you move down, what's fascinating is in physics, the power increases. As the wave, the peak and the trough of the wave in quantum mechanics becomes smaller, power literally increases. But at a certain point, the wave has to stop. At a certain point, there's nothing beyond that. In other words, there's nothing physical. And this is only, at that point, we arrive to an area of speculation. What is the source of the emanation? Where is this coming from? What is the source of the emanation? Why is there being and not non-being? Why are we here as opposed to not being here? And this is the question that must be asked, ultimately, in order to come to terms with our own finality, with our own deaths. And I think as people, as physicians, and people working with people that are literally, although in reality the Quran says that God, the idea of spiritual death is literally coming to terms with the fact that we are mortal, that we are